الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Bulugh al-Maram by Hafiz Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah, and we'll be continuing discussion by discussing still the chapter that he titled concerning Kitab al-Buyu, and discussing matters pertaining to Ahkam or Bab al-Riba, so matter that relates to al-Riba. So today, inshallah ta'ala, in this session, we'll try to read two hadith, and then we'll discuss the hadith as we'll normally discuss those hadiths. So the hadith will be read, and the hadith of Samura, and also the hadith of Abdullah bin Amr ibn As. Bi'awnillahi ta'ala. Aywa.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Hadith 704, narrated Samura bin Jundub radiallahu anhu. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam forbade selling animals for animals when payment was to be made at a later date, reported by al-Khamsah. Ibn Jarud and at-Tirmidhi graded it Sahih, authentic. Hadith 708, narrated Abdullah bin Amr bin As radiallahu anhu. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam commanded him to equip an army. Then when the camels were insufficient, he commanded him to keep back the young camels of Sadaqah. He said, I was taken a camel to be replaced by two when the camels of Sadaqah came. Reported by al-Hakim and al-Bayhaqi. Its narrators are reliable.
So these are the hadith that Author rahimahullah mentioned regarding the discussion regarding matters pertaining to al-Buyu. Sorry, matters getting to al-Buyu, but in specific matter relating to Bab al-Riba. So as for the hadith that is mentioned or that was read, the first hadith mentioned, and Samura ibn Jundub radiyallahu anhu, أن النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام نهى عن بيع حيوان بالحيوان نسيئة. Then he mentioned رواه خمسة وصححه الترمذي وابن الجارود. Then the second hadith that is mentioned, and Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, as some books mention, but they mention here Abdullah ibn Amr radiyallahu anhuma, أن رسول الله عليه السلام أمره أن يجهز جيشا فنفذت الإبل فأمره أن يأخذ على قلائس الصدقة. قال وكنت آخذ بهيرين إلى إبل الصدقة. رواه حاكم والبيهقي ورجاله ثقات. So these are the two hadith that are mentioned by the author rahimahullah ta'ala Ibn Hajar regarding matters pertaining to Ahkam al-Riba. So the first of those things that we'll do, after we'll have a takhrij of the hadith, and then after we'll go into discussion other matters relating to the hadith. So as for the first hadith of Samura radiyallahu anhu ibn Jundub, that the Prophet ﷺ said nahi an bay hayawan bil ayawan, that the Prophet ﷺ that he forbid the buying of hayawan with ayawan, and the payment is done later or delayed payment. As for this hadith that he mentioned, rawahu khamsa. So based upon what is mentioned by the editing of Sheikh Samir, that he mentioned in his checking of Bulugh al-Maram, hadith number 3, he mentioned Sahih bishawahidi, that he meant, so he states that the hadith is Sahih, authentic, with his shawahid, indicating that, so he mentioned the hadith is Sahih bishawahidihi. Then he started to mention Rawahu Abu Dawud, so the hadith can be found in Abu Dawud, Nasai, Tirmidhi, Ibn Mاجه, Ahmed. So these are al-Khamsah: Abu Dawud, Nasai, Tirmidhi, Ibn Mاجه, and Ahmed. These are al-Khamsah. Then also he added وابن الجارود, and also Ibn Jarud, his book al-Muntaqa. Also I've mentioned the hadith min طريق Hassan and Samura bihi, and the hadith is mentioned by these sources by way of Hassan al-Basri and Samura ibn Jundub radiyallahu anhu. Then I mentioned قال الترمذي. So as for at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah, when he mentioned it, he called hadithun hasanun sahih. At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah, he all the hadith to be hasanun sahih, authentic. Then he mentioned, meaning Sheikh Samir, the one who have made checking the book, قلت, of what he have added is comments. He mentioned والحسن مدلس, that Hassan al-Basri مدلس وقد أنعنا, and also he have narrated hadith an, which indicate that it needs to be verified. Then he mentioned by saying an and Samura. Then he mentioned illa anna lahu shawahid. But he said except the hadith have certain shawahid, other sources or other supporting hadith, yusah biha hadith, that will authenticate the hadith, that be with these shawahid, these other sources, that it will authenticate the hadith. Then he mentioned وَمَذْكُورٌ بِالْأَصْلِ. So that's concerning the first hadith as mentioned here. As for what is mentioned, the first hadith that we mentioned, as for what is mentioned by Sheikh Mahir in his checking of this book, Bulugh Maram, when he mentioned the hadith of Samura, anhu, that he said the hadith, when he commented on the hadith, he stated, اختلف فيه, the hadith is, there's a disagreement between the ulama on this hadith. Then he mentioned, تبيان لخلاف الحاصل, based upon that there's a difference between the ulama, في السماء, Hassan al-Basri and Samura, where the ulama, they disagree. So it's a known difference between ulama, or discussion between ulama, and they differ on this matter, that did Hassan al-Basri, al-Tabi'i, did he hear from Samura? Did he hear from the Sahabi, Samura? Then he mentioned, فَقَدْ قِيل, and you have different aqwal, that you have amongst the ulama who have put forward that, قِيل, those who have said, إِنَّهُ سَمِعَ مِنْهُ, that Hassan al-Basri, that he heard from Jundub, that he heard from Samura. Then he mentioned وَقِيل لَمْ يَسْمَعْ, and others who have stated that he did not hear from him. Then he mentioned وَقِيل لَمْ يَسْمَعْ, that Hassan al-Basri did not hear from Samura, and he mentioned إِلَّا hadith al-aqiqa, except for one hadith aqiqa. وَقِيل إِنَّمَا هُوَ kitab, that this is from a book. That he mentioned وَهُوَ مُدَلِّس, yani al-Hassan al-Basri, regarding concerning is the mudallis of those who are described as the one who mudallis, at times they may not, where their hadith sometimes need to be verified and checked, whether they actually heard the hadith directly from their sheikh or not. So I mentioned that Hassan mudallis, وَقَدْ أَنْأَنَا, that also Hassan al-Basri in this narration, he mentioned an Hassan al-Basri and Samura ibn Jundub. So in those cases of a person who is known for tadlis, and a person who is said to be described of being of those who are involved in the act of tadlis, that when they use these terms of al-an, then it does mean that things need to be checked thoroughly to see, is there any report of him clarifying or stating clearly that he heard the hadith directly. And in this case, he used the word an, so that indicate that there's a question sign regarding his narration. Then he mentioned other sources that he have discussed the hadith more in detail, but also he mentioned that hadith akhrajahu, the hadith, as for the sources of the books of hadith that have collected this hadith, he mentioned Ahmad, Abu Dawud, Ibn Mاجه, Tirmidhi, Nasai, Ibn Jarud, والبيهقي. So these are the sources that he mentioned regarding that have mentioned the hadith. Then as for the hadith of Jundub, so or Samura, and that hadith, as the ulama explained, that the hadith that as others have mentioned, that this hadith, that also it is somewhat on the discussion, as mentioned, that the more correct view, that the ulama hold that Hassan al-Basri did not hear, he heard from Samura in Jumla, and I mentioned one hadith of Aqiqah. As for other than this, then there's no clear indication that he heard directly from Samura. So they see it as munqata. So that hadith considered in qita. There's somewhat a breakage in those isnad by the narration of Hassan al-Basri and Samura ibn Jundub, except for one hadith where they kind of somewhat more in line that he heard from, which is the hadith of al-Aqiqah, the hadith of Aqiqah. Then I mentioned regarding concerns that a discussion between the ulama on this particular matter regarding this particular hadith. So of the ulama mentioned that he didn't also make it, he didn't clearly state that he heard the hadith or used terms in hadith way of how one narrate hadith. He didn't use terms or those terminologies that indicate that he heard the hadith directly, like Sami'tu and the likes. He didn't hear that I heard from him, so he used the word and, so that kind of that put a question sign to his narration. So you have a discussion between the ulama, a lengthy one, but they mentioned al-Bayhaqi and other ulama. I mentioned the hadith, the hadith the hadith they have other narration of the hadith, but I mentioned hadith is mursala and ikrama. Then also you find that with the hadith also that you find that the ulama mentioned that you have shawahid, as they mentioned you have shawahid. Of those shawahid regarding the hadith of Samura, so the hadith of Samura is daif on its own, but also you have other narration of this hadith, and of those other narration of the hadith that upon other companions, we have Ibn Omar, of those who are narrating a similar hadith. That hadith can be found in Tahawi in his book Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, and also al-Bayhaqi also have narrated hadith similar to this hadith on Ibn Omar, and they mention that with also that narration, that what is more correct regarding the narration of Ibn Omar of the hadith of Samura, similar to that of hadith of Samura, that I mentioned that fihi, that sawab fihi, and Ziyad ibn Jubair mursal, that hadith also it is mursal, so it have a breakage in the isnad. So both hadith, the asl of the root, the main hadith of Samura, there's weakness in it, it is weak. Also the other type of, they say shawahid or mutabahat, shawahid, other hadith from other companions on the same topic, which is hadith of Ibn Omar, that's narrated by Tahawi in his book Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar. Also it has weakness, it is mursal. And also Bayhaqi and narrate this hadith in his book Al-Ma'rifah. So the hadith there, the second hadith of Ibn Omar, is also weak. And they mention also that there's another hadith, that is another hadith of Jabir, Rawahu, Tirmidhi, Tahawi also. And then also that they mention that this hadith also, that you have Abu Zubair, one of the narrators, and he's known for tadlis, and he narrated with an'ana. So also again, that puts some question sign to that hadith. So they mention that all the hadith that of the hadith of Samura ibn Jundub is a weak hadith. The other shawahid also of weakness. So all the narration on this of this hadith of weakness. But they mention that because more of the weakness of the ulama, all that the hadith becomes hasan if you were to compile or put all together. So they mention that all the hadith, or they pass the judgment, some pass the judgment that the hadith, it becomes hasan lighayri, based upon all those narration with all those shawahid, that they give strength to each other, that will elevate the hadith to a level of maqbool, which is hasan lighayri. So hasan with other sources. So that's concerning the outcome of the hadith of Samura ibn Jundub, that is narrated here by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, and we mention the sources. As for the second hadith of Abdullah bin Amr ibn As, that just something to be mindful of, that in of the prince of Bulugh Maram, and also of those who have explained Bulugh Maram, for example San'ani, that you might find that in the order or the sequence of those hadith, that the hadith of Samura ibn Jundub, the hadith that sometimes come after is not this hadith. It's not this hadith. So some you might find the hadith that we have read today, the hadith of that we'll be discussing, the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, that hadith sometimes comes a few hadith later on, but not immediately after the hadith of Samura. But some book, they come together and they're discussed together, while others is mentioned later on, a few hadith later in this chapter. So that's sometimes to be mindful. So you'll find that San'ani in his explanation, Subul Salam, that the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, that it comes later. It comes later. So for one to just be mindful of that. So as for the hadith that we have read, is the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, where I mentioned the hadith that according to what is mentioned here, first regarding Shaykh al-Mahir al-Fal, when he mentioned the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, that the Prophet ﷺ, that he commanded regarding preparing of the jaysh meaning the army. Then he mentioned that with the hadith concerning takrir of the hadith, that the author rahimahullah, he mentioned Rawahu, Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned Rawahu Hakim in his book al-Mustadrak, wal-Bayhaqi. Then he mentioned وَرِجَالُهُ thiqat, and that the narrators of the hadith, that they are thiqat. Then so said that as for the first step, which is takhrij of this hadith, that he mentioned hadith with Hakim wal-Bayhaqi and Bayhaqi, that Shaykh Mahir, when he mentioned this hadith, that when he mentioned this particular hadith, that he mentioned isnaduhu daif. So Shaykh Fal, he mentioned Mahir Fal, he mentioned hadith isnaduhu daif, that all the hadith of Abdullah bin Amr ibn As to be daif. Then he mentioned, as for those who have not read them, akhrajahu, that then he mentioned fihi, then another discussion regarding why he has come to this conclusion. Fihi Ishaq Abu Abdurrahman ibn Usaid al-Ansari. Then he mentioned that qala anhu Abu Atim. Then as what is mentioned about the ulama, Al-Razi, Sheikh laysa bimashur. He mentioned Sheikh laysa bimashur, ولا يشتغل لا يشتغل به, and also not to busy oneself with him. So that's concerning his comment about one of the narrators in the isnad of the hadith. وفيه كذلك عطاء خراساني وهو يهم كثير ويرسل ويدلس. And also another narrator who's عطاء خراساني, that they mention here regarding that كثير وهم, he makes many errors, and also يرسل ويدلس. So you have all these criticism against him regarding that he narrate hadith which is incomplete isnad, and also he is classed among those who are said to be mudallis. So that's of the criticism then of the hadith. So why he have come to the conclusion hadith is da'if. Then he mentioned أخرجه أبو داود دولابي في الكنى والأسماء. So one of those books that discuss concerning kuna wa asma, Dolabi, that book is in print. Then he mentioned Tabarani في مسند الشامعين. So Tabarani rahimullah, that he has many books in hadith. Al-Ma'ajim, Al-Thalatha, Mujam al-Kabir, the three Ma'ajim, Mujam al-Kabir, wal-Awsat, wal-Saghir. But also Tabarani, he has another book that is in hadith that is called Musnad Shami'in. So Musnad Shami'in are concerning the Musnad of Shami'in, that also another of his book. So the hadith is mentioned here. Also the book is mentioned in Ibn Adi in his book Kamil, that discusses the what? Wa Abu Na'im fi al-Hilya. So, and also al-Bayhaqi. So the hadith is found in these different sources as the Sheikh he mentioned here. Sheikh Dr. Mahir al-Fahl, he mentioned these different sources. But overall, he owed the hadith to be daif. Then we just compare what is mentioned by Sheikh Samir in his checking of the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, where in both of these they mention those hadith one after another. They mention them together. Then he mentioned that as for number 4, he mentioned the hadith. As for Sheikh Samir, he mentioned the hadith Hassan. The hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, he owed it to be Hassan. Rawahu Hakim al-Bayhaqi. Then he mentioned the hadith. They mentioned Qultu. Then he says the hadith in the Hakim al-Bayhaqi. Then he mentioned Qultu as for his comments regarding this hadith. For hadith yu'al, the hadith is somewhat, it is criticized. Bima la yakhda, it is hadith is somewhat is criticized with all that with criticism that he does not see as valid. So the hadith is criticized or weakened, and he mentioned as for him he does not agree with that. Bayan dhalik al-asl, that he mentioned that so that's concerned that he mentioned hadith, but you have that discussion regarding this particular hadith. That there's some discussion regarding this particular hadith. So from what we see the hadith, that the hadith is criticized, both those hadith, but I mentioned the hadith also with this hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr. The hadith also, it is others that mentioned hadith in the Ahmed, Abu Dawud, Hakim, Bayhaqi. And they mentioned fihi also Amr ibn Harish. Amr ibn Harish, another of the narrators, and he's said to be Maj'ul al-Ain. And he's said to be Maj'ul al-Ain, that a person who's said to be Maj'ul, is not known or known. Then I mentioned, and also, fi isnadihi ittirab aid, and also, there are a lot of confusion regarding the isnad. There are a lot of, that discussion and discrepancy regarding the isnad. So based upon this, the all hadith to be, then I mentioned, Rawahu Darakutni wal Bayhaqi, and also this hadith also is narrated also again by Darakutni and Bayhaqi and Amr ibn Shuhaib and Abi Hanjaddi. And they mentioned that narration is more authentic, which is a Hassan. So the more correct they mentioned, so this hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, that's narrated by, they mentioned that Amr ibn Shuhaib and Abi Hanjaddi, that the hadith is Hassan, based upon that other tariq, So that's concerning this particular discussion regarding this hadith. As we said that just be mindful that this hadith, that in some of the books of hadith, that both are not mentioned together, that the hadith of Amr ibn As, Abdullah ibn Amr ibn As, it is mentioned a few hadith later in the book, as we find in some of the prints. And next of those matters that they discuss, so that's concerning those hadith. So the hadith, both hadith are criticized of the ulama or hadith to be Hassan, and those who hold the hadith not to be. So you find, for example, the first hadith of Samura, that you find that Sheikh Bassam in his explanation and comments of Bulugh Maram, he mentioned hadith al-Hasan. So you hold the hadith to be Hassan, based upon the different shawa'id, and also preceding all of them at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah. So at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah mentioned Hadith Hasanun Sahih. So even though there are discussion regarding did Hasan al-Basri hear this hadith from Samura. Then also they mentioned Ibn Hajar rahimahullah, if some mentioned, فَذَكْرَ لَهُ that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah in the book Fath al-Bari, as for the first hadith of Samura, that he mentioned that he kind of somewhat mentioned فَقَدْ ذَكْرَ لَهُ عِدَّةُ الطُّرُقِ يُقَوِّي بَعْضُهَا بَعْض, that he all that those hadith because of all the different narrations of Jabir, Ibn Umar and Samura, when all are combined together, that they give strength to each other, made hadith Hasan. Then also Sheikh Bassam, the second hadith mentioned isnaduhu qawi, that he all the hadith to be isnaduhu qawi, that he all constantly mentioned that فَقَدْ صَحَّهُ, that Hakim authenticated hadith, and according to him mentioned وَوَافَقَهُ al-Dhahabi, he mentioned وَوَافَقَهُ al-Dhahabi. That particular statement amongst the ulama of hadith is to be, there's some discussion regarding that statement, regarding saying وَافَقَهُ, yani that al-Dhahabi rahimahullah, that he wafaq, he coincide or agreed with al-Hakim. That matter is a little discussion on that statement. وَصَحَّهُ al-Bayhaqi والنووي, and he mentioned of those who authenticate hadith of Abdullah bin Amr ibn As, he mentioned al-Bayhaqi and also al-Nawawi. But also the hadith is criticized by others. They mentioned that Khattabi rahimullah in his mention وفي إسناده مقال, that in the isnad is maqal, and also again Ibn Hajar rahimullah, he strengthened the hadith, he all the hadith to be authentic. But discussion regarding those hadith, discussion regarding those particular hadith. As for the mawdu of this hadith, that is mentioned, or the mawdu of this hadith, that the mawdu of this hadith is discussing concern is not regarding concern to not hayawan. Do they also fall in the category of riba? Does hayawan, the selling and the purchase of hayawan, does this also fall into what is bab of riba occurring in this particular cases? Then, so the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, I'm going to mention to know that they had, the Prophet ﷺ was preparing a jaysh, and he asked the second hadith of Abdullah bin Umar ibn As to prepare that jaysh, to get them ready regarding getting a silah, and also ride for them, mode of transport for them. So he had prepared certain type of horses or ibl. So when these camels, then eventually that faniyat, nafidat al-ibl, when they kind of somewhat that, they run out. So they had more men without horses, or sorry, without ibl, without a camel. Then he mentioned that he was then asked to get some others. Then he did. Then I mentioned, Shah mentioned, وَكُنْتُ آخِذ بَهِير بِبَيِّرْعَيْن, that I would take 2 bahir for 1. And that would be paid off later. That would be paid later from Ibla Sadaqah. So that's concerning that particular hadith that we have. Then as for now, the Masahil al-Fiqhiyya, as for what is mentioned regarding Masahil al-Fiqhiyya, they discuss of those things that they discuss. One, that they discuss, and a discussion between ulama, bay, the first the masail that is discussed, bay al-hayawan, bil-hayawan, nasi'ah, that is it permissible for one to buy hayawan, livestock with livestock, but the payment is made later. The payment is made later. So a delay in the payment. So they mentioned that on this matter there's a khilaf between the ulama, where of this matter, of those ulama who mentioned la yajuz, that is not so regarding is it allowed for a person to purchase hayawan with hayawan, but there's a delay in payment. So one mentioned, I'll buy from you 10 camels and I will pay you 15, but it will be done later. But we agree upon it from now. but the payments were done. I will give you yours next 2 weeks, and you'll return and you'll give me mine's 3 weeks after. So they mentioned that as for this matter, the ulama mentioned there's a khilaf between the ulama of bay, the purchase and selling of hayawan, with animals with animals, or livestock with livestock. They mentioned la yajuz. Of the ulama who mentioned that it is not permissible. Bay al-hayawan bi-ayawan, of selling and the trading of hayawan with hayawan. إذا كان أحدهما آجل. If one of those are received later. So if one or both, أو كلاهما. So if the exchange, it occurs later, either for both animals or livestock, or one is giving now and the other one will give is later, they mention that لا يجوز. It is not allowed to be done. They mention سواء اختلفت الأجناس أو اتفق. So whether the animals that they are the same, sheep with sheep, or sheep with cow, regardless dimension, is not allowed unless both are sold together without anyone delaying any. Then I mentioned kalbi, that's for example selling. For example, I mentioned the selling of camel with camels or camels with sheep. So if there's any delay of one being passed on, then it is not allowed. Then I mentioned in the Prophet Islam that the Prophet Islam mentioned, so when the Prophet mentioned nasi'a means ta'khir. As he mentioned regarding the hadith, where he stated in the hadith that the Prophet Islam naha an bay hayawan bi hayawan nasi'a. So I said this is the hadith that says it's not allowed. But the Prophet Islam he forbade of this act, and nasi'a means ta'khir, that a person will do so it is delayed. It is done later. So they mentioned that it's not allowed. So they mentioned regarding concern that that in this particular transaction that the exchange have to occur immediate for both sides. The exchange of the animals or the livestock after done, taqabud, after be done, the exchange after be done immediate in the majlis al-act, as the purchase, right after the purchase have occurred. And that's a matter, they said that's a matter of the Hanafiya and also riwayah li Ahmed. So regarding of those who take the position is not allowed, they mentioned Hanafiya, and the second are riwayah, a narration upon Imam Ahmed rahimahullah ta'ala. The second opinion on this matter, yajuz al-bay' al-hayawan bi-hayawan, that it is permissible to sell livestock with livestock. They mentioned it is permissible. That I mentioned إذا كان أحدهما حاضر والآخر غائب. So either whether one is present and the other one is absent. Whether they agree they're from the same type, cows with cows or cows with camels. They mention it, both is أجناس اتفاق الأجناس أو اختلف. Whether they agree or they're the same. Then they mentioned that, so the permissive, they mentioned that, and Omar that they mentioned that in the hadith of Abdullah bin Amr bin As, where he did so of Ba'ir bil Ba'ir, and also that some of them were absent, others were absent. So from this they mentioned there's something which is allowed to be done. So there's a delay, and the one that were delayed, he mentioned Abdullah that Abdullah, he took those animals, the camels, and then the payment for them was done later. The payment was done for the Ibn Sadaqah. This was done, Nasi, and this was done later. So they mentioned, this proved that it can be done. So according to them, they hold a position that it can be done. I mentioned also that it is something which is, as the some mentioned that, الَّذِي تَوَاتَرْ عَنِ الصَّحَابَةِ, that majority of the Sahaba, or it is something which is a common practice or position taken by the Sahaba. That the Sahaba were of this opinion that selling of hayawan, livestock with livestock, animals with animals, it is something which is allowed. It is allowed. Then they kind of explain their response. Those who say it's allowed, that their response to the hadith of that we mentioned, the hadith of Samura, that mentioned it is not allowed. They mentioned that is regarding concern in the case concerning that they mentioned that either is in the case of the hadith of Samura is regarding cases such as أن يكون من باب بيع الدين بالدين, that both are going to buy these animals, but it's going to be done delayed. It's going to be done, both going to delay in doing so. where both sides are going to delay the exchange of the animals until later. They agree now, but the exchange of the animals will be done later. They said that hadith of Samura is to be taken in that understanding. That is what is forbidden. That is the case that is forbidden. So they mentioned it, and that's trying to combine between both hadiths. So it is allowed if some give, but if both sides delay, then it's not allowed. But if one side give, then and one side delay, it is allowed. Then I mentioned that also the other response that the hadith of Samura is daif. The hadith of Samura is daif. But we mentioned that, that matter is discussed between the ulama. And that's the qawl that is taken by Jumhur of the ulama. So Jumhur, majority of the ulama, position that it is allowed the sale of animals with animals or livestock with livestock. A second matter that is discussed between the ulama, bay al-lahm bil hayawan, that a person now meat, and I mentioned that selling, so say that livestock in the sense of those are live livestock. They are live. Then a second case I discussed regarding concerning al-bay al-lahm bil hayawan, that what's the ruling pertaining to selling meat, the exchange of or the purchase of meat using, or the purchase of hayawan using meat. So one is alive and the other deceased. They mentioned that you have different suratan, you have different situation with this one. The first case of this is the case regarding akun al-lahm min jins al-hayawan, that if that lamb is from the same animals, both of the same type, that shat with shat. So in the case of both are shat with shap, so regarding the lahm, the meat, then you have that case where an yakun lahm bil lam jins, that Sahih alladhi عليه جمهور العلماء أنه لا يجوز, that Jumhur of the ulama all concern the person who have the meat of the animal. So the animal meat, meaning the animal is dead, and you have the meat itself, and you want to sell cow meat with cow meat, or goat meat with goat meat, or meat of meat with meat. They mention Jumhur of the ulama, they tell us that أنه لا يجوز البيع حيوان الحي باللحم من جنسي. That they mention regarding concerning in this case concerning that that selling animal that are alive with lam meaning concerning not the dead, then is not allowed. From the same animals, it is not allowed. As the Prophet mentioned, أن النبي عليه السلام نهى أن تباع الشاه باللحم. That the Prophet in the Hadith, in the al-Hakim al-Bayhaqi, and others, the Hadith also of Samura, ولم يسر بالسماء, also the Hadith also against with Samura, whenever that that the Prophet forbid regarding the sale of a goat, a sheep, with that of meat. So they mentioned that of the evidence they use, but the hadith also is criticized. That hadith is somewhat criticized as being weak, but also you have other narration that they said added together, it gives strength to that hadith. So that's a view taken. Then you have another mention that the person selling meat, using meat to buy an animal that's they're of two different types. One, using goat meat, sheep meat to buy ibl. Is that allowed? They mentioned regarding concern ulama that they mentioned that because they have different jins that they mentioned, it is allowed. That they mentioned that if they have different, so you have the that Jumhur of ulama they mentioned yajuz, that if they have the same, they differ, then it is allowed. If they are the same, no. But if they are the same type, yes. So, or if they have different type, it is allowed. If they have the same type, same animal, then they said is not allowed. So that's concerning what is mentioned by, and I mentioned that if there's a difference in the type of animal, the Prophet of Islam mentioned regarding إذا اختلفت هذه أصناف فيبيع كيف شئت إذا كان يدا بيد. So the Prophet of Islam can say that if the animals, if the items are of two different types, then you sell it as you wish. You sell it as you wish. So I mentioned if the meat are of different type, goat or sheep using to buy, camel, then they mention this is allowed because they have different types. But it also mentioned as the call taken by aqwal of the ulama. That's the view of the Malikiyah and also of the Hanabila. So the Malikiyah and the Hanabila, that they all let you know it is allowed in that case. As for the other view of the Shafi'iyah and the riwayah in Ahmad, أنه لا يجوز. Again, they all it is not allowed because both are meat from livestock, from animals. So that's the view of between the ulama on this particular matter, where the Prophet Islam, they mentioned, Prophet Islam comes to that nahi Rasulullah an nabi asha bilam. So I mentioned that in the Prophet Islam that he forbade that the selling of a sheep with lamb, with meat. They said that applies in all cases, whether of the same type or of the different type of animal. It applies across the board. So those are the aqwal of the ulama on that particular matter. Then you have a next view of the Zahiriyah and the Hanafiyah. The Zahiriyah and the Hanafiyah that they mentioned because ذهبوا إلى جواز البيع حيوان باللحم من جنسي أو من غير جنسي. So the Ahnaf and the Zahiriyah, that they view that it applies across the board. Whether those animals, whether it is from the meat with something similar type, sheep with sheep, or sheep meat with cow meat. They mention whether they are similar or different, it doesn't matter. Both are allowed. They mention that both cases are allowed. Whether animals are similar, the meat with animal, or they're different, that it is allowed. That's concerned the aqwal of that. When I mentioned the hadith that mentions matter, it is daif. The hadith that mentioned is not allowed, that they are daif. So it go back to its asl. So those are some of the aqwal of the ulama on that matter regarding what is mentioned the hadith. Then they mention regarding concern that as mentioned by some of the ulama, and I've mentioned regarding as stated by Sheikh Bassam, where he mentioned regarding concerning that بناء على, as he mentioned of the points, وبناء عليه فلا ربا بين حيوان بعضها ببعض. That I mentioned that as for hayawan, that riba does not apply between hayawan. So regarding concern the hadith, so I show that one can buy, for example, 2 sheep or with 1, that there's no, even though they differ in number, that he mentioned there's no riba, that one can sort of, so there is no riba that applies in those cases. There's no riba that applies in those cases. Then they mention also that, as mentioned here, that and Sa'id ibn Musayyib, as he mentioned, لا riba في حيوان. So Sa'id ibn Musayyib rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned لا riba في حيوان. بعير بعيراني بعيرعيني, that 2 بعير with 2 بعير أو شاة بشاتتين or إلى أجل. So a person can also that do this type of exchange where 1 animal for the 2 and of the same type and 1. So they mentioned that this is something which is allowed and there is no riba in such cases. No riba in these cases. San'ani rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentioned a masala regarding this particular hadith. When this hadith is mentioned, that's a matter discussed between the ulama regarding that so I found a hadith in as is hadith is different numbering. So that's what I also says. That's we leave that masala as they discuss a matter that we'll pick it up again later on. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll pick it up later on regarding this masala. But it's a matter they discuss between concerning that is the permiss. So we discussed that matter regarding the permissibility of qard, of a person loaning of hayawan. The permissibility of loaning of or lending of hayawan is this something which is permissible. That Shawkani rahimahullah, he mentions that's في دليل الجواز اقتراض الحيوان, that regarding of loaning of hayawan, he mentioned فيه أقوال, that ulama have different aqwal in this matter. The first view regarding the loaning or borrowing of hayawan, he mentioned jawaz dhalik, that is something which is allowed between the ulama, that one can borrow or loan out hayawan. And I mentioned that jawaz dhalik of the ulama who said it is allowed for this to be done. And I mentioned that هو قول الشافعي ومالك وجماهير علماء السلف والخلف, that this is the position taken by Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, from al-Arba, and also is the predominant view of majority of the ulama, of the Salaf wal Khalaf, of those of the early scholars and those who came after them. So of the Salaf wal Khalaf, then so of the classical and those who came after, amalan bihad hadith, where they act upon this hadith, where I mentioned that also regarding this matter, that asl regarding al-qard, that borrowing and loaning of thing, it is jaiz. So I said no, because of the asl, that the original ruling, the ruling is that it is permissible for it to be done. So that applies in this case. Then they mention another view of the ulama, that yajuz mutlaqa, that I mentioned it applies. So some put some exception. They mentioned that would just said mutlaqa, that they put in all cases. They put in all cases. Some of the ulama say it is permissible in the case regarding hayawan, but then they said in general that is allowed regarding loaning and borrowing. They have an exception to certain cases. But with another second view, which is the view of Ibn Jarir or Dawud al-Zahiri, that I mentioned that is allowed in all cases. So the person, anything that you possess, you can loan and you can borrow something from others that are owed to them. Then I mentioned a view that is owed by the Hanafiya. He mentioned Hadawiyya, we don't need to mention them, but they are from the Zaydiyya, one of the groups of the Zaydiyya, the Hadawiyya. But they mentioned then, as San'ani in his book Subul Salam, that it will include the views of the Zaydiyya. It includes the views of the Zaydiyya. So he mentioned Al-Hanafiyya, أنه يجوز قرض شيء من حيوان. That لا يجوز, that this view, the third view, أنه لا يجوز, it is not allowed regarding قرض شيء من حيوان, the person to loan or to borrow anything regarding of the animal mentioned. وهذا يرد قولهم وتقدم دعواهم النسخ. Well, again, that's something what so that's the view taken by the Hanafi, and they mentioned that view there's no real that view is not correct. That view is incorrect. So that's of the masala they discussed are taken from this regarding the permissibility of a person borrowing or loaning of hayawan, livestock or animals. Three aqwal, those who say it is allowed with certain exception, those who mentioned allowed in that it's allowed, and those who say it is not allowed. So those who say it's allowed regarding this, but an loan in general is allowed, or a person borrowing is allowed. They mention one exception. Then you have the Zahiriyya or Dawud al-Zahiri, all that it is allowed in all cases without any exceptions. And those who mention is not allowed regarding cases regarding borrowing of hayawan, or borrowing of hayawan, it is not allowed. So that's concerning aqwal of the ulama on this matter. The last thing that we'll end with is some of the fawaid. If there's so it mentioned regarding concern now of those fawaid regarding that, they mentioned that dhabit al-riba. So dhabit al-riba, they mention annahu yaqa bayna makil wal mawzun, that regarding things that relates to riba is things that can be weighed or measured. Thing that can be weighed or measured. Whether concerned in a kind of thing which is ma'atoom, thing which is said to be food items or the likes. Also they mentioned that that there's no riba fi hayawanat. So regarding hayawanat, livestock and animals, then between themselves there's no riba. So a person can buy one sheep for two, because there's no riba, and the payment is done later. there's no riba, interest, usury in cases of hayawan. As for the lahm, the meat of animals, and they mentioned that it can occur, riba can occur. So riba can occur in meat, in the meat itself that they mentioned, in case of something which is weighed and measured, then it can occur with فلا يجوز بيع, where so they mentioned, that of the same meat, goat with goat, sheep with sheep, instead of those meat, then there should be no type of, either one maybe of a ayah breed, then they have to be of the same weight, without per se one being more than the other, as riba can occur in those matters, according to this view. As I mentioned, something which is mawzu or mat'um, it is something which is weighed, and also something which is a food item. Also should consider the matter regarding isti'dad lil jihad. The Prophet Islam concerned the Prophet Islam that was getting the people ready and prepared for jihad. So should jihad, it remains until Yawm al-Qiyamah, and also for the head of state to be always and be prepared and regarding jihad, and also commissioning the Prophet Islam commissioned Abdullah bin Omar bin As to get everything ready and prepared for regarding a jihad, and also that finding that for the warriors that they are all prepared, that also those of the soldiers that they are prepared. It mentioned the hadith mentioned that that concerning Nabi Islam amarahu yani Abdullah bin Amr bin As and yujahiz jayshan. They mentioned that as for the Prophet Islam commanded him, instructed him for him to get the jaysh prepared and organized, by way of getting them that everything is in place for them and ready and prepared for jihad, which is for jihad. They mentioned that jaysh, which is like Jundub, etc., that jaysh or juyush is used as the army or soldiers. And I mentioned the aqal that referred to as a jaysh aqal, they mentioned it is arbamiyah. So if you have anything over, above 400 is referred to, the summit is referred to as a jaysh. And some mention qil, some say the least that is required is arba alaf, is 4,000. So a khilaf between the ulama as to how many men or soldiers is needed for the army to be called a jaysh, 400 plus or 4,000 plus. So also from this it shows regarding that in certain type of thing, jawaz, ta'jil, fi ada, that at times the person may delay in fulfilling of something. So in fulfilling of something, a person might delay in this based upon circumstance, situation. So maybe and can go beyond a day or more. So at times the person may delay carrying out something. It can exceed a day or more. So it is something which is allowed. But so not in the sense of the person procrastinating, not in that sense. Not procrastinating in that sense. And also regarding that, the purchase of hayawan with hayawan that are alive and a delay payment in with that there's no riba that falls into this. That riba does not fall into this. So so those are some of the general benefits that can be taken from this particular hadith. And with that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll end the discussion regarding this hadith that discusses some points regarding al-riba, or in the chapter of al-riba that relates to al-hayawan. So with that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll end this discussion and continue regarding the other hadith that are discussed by the author, rahimahullah, in this book, Bulugh Maram min Adillat al-Ahkam, by Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, wa ghafra Allahu lahu. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل. How long was that one?